Shalom, my name is Yehoshua Yaakov from Jerusalem. Let's just check and see if the volume is up. Yeah, okay, grand, it is. I'm commenting on the Pat Condell video, Hook, Line, and Rapture. Well, Pat Condell, you are one heck of an impressive guy. You talk with a tremendously impressive repertoire. You've got the audience is spellbound. So I have a few questions. First, let me repeat my introduction. I'm Yehoshua Yaakov. I live in Jerusalem. I'm an American citizen. I used to live in London, in fact, Pat, some years ago. When I was Michael O'Donnell, I was born and raised an Irish Catholic, and that's another story. And 22 years ago, after 25 or so years ago, I converted to Judaism. Because my mother is Jewish, and I returned to Israel. I live in Jerusalem. I heard you were here, and I listened to one of your videos about all of the solutions that you have. It's kind of like the solutions about you have for all of the youth of the world that are the many people who are tuning into your videos. I'm sure you're aware that there's a lot of youngsters very impressed with your raptious dialogue. You're almost as good as Pat Robertson when it comes to spinning your atheism. Now, let me just go right to the subject here. You're an intelligent fellow. I think you're an invention of other people before you, and you bill yourself as a comic, and I think that's a very good choice. But Chris Hitchens is not a comic. He's serious, and there's a close corollary between your dialogic and his. But let's get to first atheism. God doesn't exist. And in your video, you say that God, in the dream, God revealed himself to him. And he said, he doesn't exist, and that's it. This to be a fact. Well, I find that very interesting. I want to help you to understand a couple things about God's existence that you don't seem to know. But you seem to be convincing everybody that you know everything that proves God doesn't exist. So, okay, who am I to argue with you? You know what you know. But let me just bring up one little small point here that I think that might be interesting, you might find interesting. God cannot exist for you, Pat. And this is a fact. I agree with it. I'm not gonna tell you gotta believe in God and that God exists. No way, Pat. You're right. But Pat, I'd be willing to bet a long nickel. It's before the dime drops on Pat. I would be willing to bet you the long nickel that you don't know why God doesn't exist. Now, Pat, it's because you don't exist. There you go. There's the answer. How can God exist when you don't exist? Now, I realize you had a tough life. You grew up a Roman Catholic. I understand that. I was born and raised to a young, impressionable age in Roman Catholicism, and it has its problems. But I have another question for you. For a guy who is so sure that God doesn't exist, and I'm sure we're talking about the God of the cosmos. I mean, there just can't be any God, okay? He's just doesn't exist. Okay. And now that we understand that God cannot possibly exist, particularly for you, Pat, because you don't exist, can you tell me, Pat, do you know why you don't exist? Pat, you can't know who you are unless you know who God is. Now, I bet you never heard of that before. And that's why God doesn't exist, because you don't exist. And the tragedy of the fact that you grew up and in circumstances and in situations and in the constraints of education and training and influence to not know what identity resolution is and its essential nexus to the creator of the cosmos. So there's a clear void in your existential needs for identity, and that is you don't know who you are. And that's why you're a comic. And I think you're a very good comic, by the way. Now, another thing, when you don't know who you are, let me ask you, do you know why? Pat, you're flaming for attention. And I'll bet you don't even know why. Look, here you got 1 million views on the YouTube. You've got a dozen videos and a couple hundred views. Hey, everybody knows who Pat Donald is. You can't even keep up with those hundreds of emails a day. I mean, you're a celebrity, Pat. Now, let me ask you another question. If you don't exist, now, there's a little problem here. God can't exist. And the question is, again, I repeat, why do you not exist, Pat? It's very simple, Pat. If you don't know who you are, how could you possibly exist? How can you know who you are? And then there's another problem. Since you don't know who you are, you're flaming for attention, I said. And you get all this attention, and it still isn't enough. If you got 1 million views of your videos a day, it still wouldn't be enough for you, Pat, because you don't exist. And no matter how much attention you get, it ain't enough. Why is it not enough? Pat, because you don't give any attention to yourself. And that's the proof, Pat, that you don't exist. Now, Pat, I'll bet this is all revelatory to you. You've never heard of this before. And who said this is true? I mean, this is some crazy Jew in Jerusalem preaching religion and belief in God. And Pat isn't going to put up with that. He's going to sling his diaper at me, and he's going to make a couple of videos and say, you better stop talking like that to me. Pat, you're flaming. We have an expression in Israel, and it's pretty common around the world. Come down from the roof, children, before you hurt yourself. Pat, you're flaming for attention because you don't know who you are and you don't give attention to yourself. So all the attention in the world you're getting from all these videos and this rubbish and dialogic and Pat. Problem isn't Pat Robertson. The problem is you, Pat. You don't exist, and when you exist, then there's a possibility for other people to exist, and who knows, maybe even God. But in the meantime, Pat, you're just making a lot of noise, flaming for attention, and no matter how, I repeat, no matter how much attention you get, it ain't going to be enough because you don't give attention to yourself. Now, what you need to know, Pat, is the difference between giving to receive, which is galut, exile, and that's what you were brought up and weaned on, and that you're flaming about and you reject, and you can see in your videos you're angry, and you're blaming God. But Pat, it's time you take responsibility for giving to receive. That's the model, the sociologic, anthropologic, psychologic model of the mind, of the schizophrenic mind, of exile. And you got problems. Now, I'm not going to tell you to go to the psychiatrist or to the priest or to, a voodoo specialist, but there is a solution, Pat. Man and mankind's exile has ended, and the new paradigm of redemption of man and mankind is kabel b'shvilatet. I'm sorry, that's Hebrew, and you don't believe in God. So let me say it in English. It's receiving to give. Receiving what, Pat? Receiving the authentic you. To give the authentic you. To who? Yeah, that's right, Pat. To the real you. Now, Pat, you might try this, and lo and behold, Pat, you're going to get a big surprise. You're going to find out that there's a real Pat in this world. And when you find out that there's a real Pat Donald, gosh, there might even be further surprises for Pat. In the meantime, Pat, I love you. I'm not picking on you. You are pretty comic. And I think you got an interesting dialogic. Thank you for listening. I'm Yehoshua Yaakov from Jerusalem. Grow up, and you might find that you really like yourself when you find out who you really are. I'm Yehoshua Yaakov from Jerusalem. Thank you for listening. And I wish you kabel b'shvilatet, the blessing of receiving to give, to you, to your family, to your community, and to all my friends in the UK. Thank you for listening.